This is CUNY TV, the City University of New York.
Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. Well, not exactly. Well, really not at all. Today, it's the Middle East, a cradle of civilization, the home of the three religions of the book. Is the region becoming even more unstable, more threatening, more dangerous? Iran, Egypt, Syria. Is this a clash of civilizations? Joining me to discuss these and other questions is Michael Wahid Hanna. Michael is a fellow at the Century Foundation. He focuses on the Middle East and U.S. foreign policy in the region and on issues of international security and human rights. Prior to joining the Century Foundation, Michael was a senior fellow at the International Human Rights Law Institute, where he conducted research on post-conflict justice, victims' rights under international law, and the Iraqi High Criminal Court. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
These are indeed interesting times. Let's start with some headlines that struck me. New York Times, December 4th, Egyptian vote forces Islamists to confront their divide. Times again, December 7th, military flexes its muscles as Islamists gain in Egypt. Financial Times, December 15th, Islamist battle for votes among the poor and the pious. What are we talking about here? When we use the term Islamist to describe what's happening in Egypt, Tunisia, and in much of the region, give me some definitions.
It's a very broad categorization. Political Islam, for the most part, is a political movement and political parties that seek to base their political program on Islamic principles. And that can take very different form. It could be a very rigid, inflexible application, very fundamentalist in outlook. It could be something less so, less rigid, and looking to inspiration from religious teachings. And so it covers a wide spectrum of different political parties, but those groups who would like to see Islam play a bigger role in political life.
At the minimum, what would this bigger role be, even among the quote-unquote moderate Islamists?
Well, I mean, even here, it's hard to speak too hyperbolically, because some people want this to be the basis of all legislation, and they want Islam to be the one driving force in terms of society. Other groups have a more pluralistic outlook, but want to take inspiration from Islamic teachings. And so even here, you do have quite a bit of variety and divergence among Islamists themselves.
Okay, another term, Sharia law. What are we talking about here?
Well, Sharia is Islamic law, and what that means is different depending on who you're talking to. And it's hard to decipher exactly what that means.
Are there core principles here?
Well, there are those things that are in the Quran, and those, I think, are seen as having somewhat higher sort of...
And they might be what?
Well, I mean, issues of inheritance and family law and these types of things where there's specific scriptural instruction as to how to proceed, as opposed to other forms of Sharia that are based on interpretation. And so once you're in the realm of interpretation, you have different schools of thought and different conclusions, and it becomes a more contested issue.
What about Sharia and civil society?
Well, I mean, this is a big question. This is something that Egypt and Libya and Tunisia, all these countries now in transition, are going to have to face. What does it mean? In Egypt now, almost certainly Article 2 of the Constitution says that Sharia is the main source of legislation. It has said this in the previous constitution too. It didn't actually become a sort of hugely animating force in Egyptian legal life and legal culture. How that gets translated in the future, I think, is an open question, and it could go one of many different ways. But obviously, these three societies are facing this question now, and it's not something that anybody has an easy answer for.
And then the third term, before we get into the specific countries, jihad.
Sure. I mean, jihad means struggle in Arabic, and can take on a variety of different meanings. It could be the personal struggle. It could be the actual violent struggle. And so I think context is important, and It depends on how it's being used, frankly.
Okay, now let's apply some of this. Tunisia just recently celebrated the first anniversary of the beginning of the Arab Spring, and they've had elections there, and the so-called moderate Islamists won that election. What does that mean specifically in terms of both internal governance and civil society as well as external relations?
Sure. Well, I mean, the Nahda party is Tunisia's biggest party. It's an Islamist party. I think we can describe them, particularly the leadership level, as a moderate Islamist party. They won 40% of the vote. And what this means is that they have to deal with the other parties. They have no competitors on the right. Egypt has the Salafis, and I'm sure we'll talk about them later. They don't exist as a political force in Tunisia. And so Islamist parties in Tunisia have to look to the other parties who won 60% of the vote. And so that creates a much different climate. They're dependent on cooperation to move things forward.
You use the word moderate. What is it? What is moderate about it, and moderate compared to what in what context?
They believe in pluralism. They believe in the ability of other secular liberal parties to compete on equal footing with them. They respect their views. They have a limited notion about how Islam shapes the Constitution. And they have a much greater focus on their social aspects and the social aspects of their movement. And as opposed to being prescriptive and closing down political space, they are willing to accommodate other political forces in a pluralistic framework. And that's a big concession. And that's an important thing to acknowledge about Tunisia that should make us more optimistic, I think, about Tunisia than perhaps some of the other places we're watching at the moment.
Okay, let's go to some of those places that we're watching. Let's start with Egypt.
Sure.
Egypt is in the headlines. It's, government repression in the streets, front page of the Times, carrying protesters out after demonstrations. The government says nothing's happening. It's very peaceful, no repression. And meanwhile, there's video transmitted instantaneously around the world of security forces firing handguns into the crowd. First of all, what's sort of going on at the moment is sort of in this fog of war situation?
Sure. I mean, we talk about Tunisia. Tunisia is a country of approximately 10 million people. It's on the periphery of the Arab world and Arab political life. Egypt's a whole other story.
Right.
So it is the sort of has been the traditional heart of the Arab world, 83 million people. What happens here is going to have a huge impact. What's going on now is a mess. I think under the best of circumstances, it was going to be a very complicated process. After 6 years of repression and stunted political life, it's hard for these things to evolve overnight. It does take time. I would say, though, that the ruling military council, which is often referred to as the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, has done an incredibly poor job of leading this transition. There has been no vision for where Egypt is headed. They've mixed their ideas about the fate of the country with their own institutional interests, and they've created a bit of a crisis. There's obviously a political crisis ongoing in Egypt, and political leadership hasn't yet been able to fill that void.
What's the nature of the political crisis?
I think particularly back in February, there has been a huge gap between political protest and mobilization in the street and that real power that managed to topple a government, and translating that power into political power. That process hasn't happened for a variety of reasons.
Go ahead.
I mean, one, the existing political leadership in Egypt is somewhat bankrupt. And so there's been a real lack of connection between political leadership at a top level and these mass movements in the streets. There's also quite a bit of suspicion from the bottom up. These were leaderless movements, and which made them resilient at the time, but which has complicated their ability to translate this
You need
power
organization.
Exactly.
Okay. So you've got this, and one of the things that struck me when what you just said, your characterization of the political leadership, both past and to a certain extent current, as corrupt and bankrupt. If you go through the Maghreb in North Africa and you move into the Middle East, there is virtually no state that doesn't conform to your definition.
That's
Every
probably
one
true.
of them.
Sure. It repressed political life, a real effort to quash political organization. To the extent that political parties were up and running in Egypt, they were co-opted. They were corrupt by their very nature. That's why the state allowed them to exist as they did. And that's a problem in terms of translating into this next phase when there's a real need for credible political leadership. And this political class that's emerging in Egypt has also been a failure in terms of prioritizing national interests, and that's been a real failing in these months since the toppling of the Mubarak regime.
Okay, let's look at the parliamentary elections. There are three-stage parliamentary elections leading to a parliament at the end of January. We've gone through two phases. The first phase at the end of November, the second phase the second week in December.
We're still in that phase.
And we're still in that phase. I'm looking at this and I'm getting worried. I'm reading the newspaper accounts, the magazine accounts on the role of the Salafi, this very fundamentalist group that surprised everyone with 25% of the vote in the first round. And it seems that in the second round, their percentage is even increasing.
Yes, 31.
So, I mean, am I being too dramatic? But when I looked at what these folks believe in, they want to go back to the first 3 generations of Islam, which begins in 1610. So we're going back to the 7th century. Do we have in a sense, is there a clash of civilizations here, paradigms, worldviews?
Well, I mean, their rise was a shock to Egyptians. I think most analysts and most Egyptian political analysts saw them as having maybe 5 to 10% of the vote. So 25% in the first round of the list election. It went down a little bit, around 20, but 31% in the second round. This has been a big shock, no doubt, and it's not a positive development. I mean, I think people are hesitant to make value judgments. Among the Salafis, there are differences, but they are, as a matter of course, and generally speaking, very rigid in terms of their outlook and unseasoned. With the Muslim Brotherhood, there are things in their platform and their positions that I find quite problematic, but they've been a part of political life. They've gotten to know and perhaps begin to understand the notion of compromise. They served in parliaments in the Mubarak government. I mean, it was a sort of stilted political life.
So would you consider the Muslim Brotherhood moderate Islamists?
Well, they're more moderate than the Salafis.
Oh, okay. So this is all relative.
It's all relative.
To a certain extent, to the base denominator, which seems to be the Salafis.
Right. I mean, I would say that Nahda party, the main Islamist party in Tunisia, is more moderate than the Muslim Brotherhood, as we know it. Now, this is a big test for the Brotherhood. We don't know how they are going to act when they are now the lead political party in the country. I mean, there's a big test and there's a big responsibility on them. They've made a lot of the right noises, but they, in the recent past have held very problematic positions. So this is a real important moment for them, and we should judge them on their actions now.
Okay, let's look at them and look at the military. We talked earlier, in a sense, the government in many ways has blown it so far, but over the last several days, you really do have a rise in violence, increased contact, and increased conflict. The military seems to be losing some of its legitimacy certainly among the protesters, if not the population.
Right, and this is an important distinction, and I think the protesters aren't Egypt,
right.
and the military still controls state TV, and this is a huge propaganda outlet to push their narrative of events. Egypt is being attacked, it's being undermined, its security is being eroded by thugs and others who have ill intent.
But isn't this the traditional story of the Irish?
It's the Mubarak line,
Right. Okay. Go ahead.
restated.
I'm sorry.
No, not at all. I mean, it's an excellent observation because these are the same tropes that were used then.
Sure.
I think what's happened though is that there is a great deal of fatigue in Egypt with protest. The economy is doing very badly. People are hurting, and people do have a sense that things are slipping a bit out of control. And so this narrative does have quite a bit of impact. I think
sort of the anti-protest narrative.
Absolutely. I think more important, however, is what the political class does, because the sort of silent majority, we call it a silent majority for a reason. It's silent. It's not mobilized. It's an important lever of influence in terms of support for the military and its actions. But what we've seen with the military is that it backs down when faced with very concerted, unified opposition among all of Egypt's political actors. That's something that it finds difficult to go against. And so I think in the next few days, what will be important is to see where blame is laid by all the various political forces in Egypt, and perhaps most importantly here is the Muslim Brotherhood.
Crystal ball?
It's tough to say. The Muslim Brotherhood came out with a somewhat sharper than usual statement with respect to laying a lot of blame on the military. They do not like frontal conflict with the military.
Sure.
They're doing well in these elections. The sort of transition process set up by the military is good to them. It's been a struggle for them to act, to sort of moderate between their own institutional interests, which are being served by the current transition,
Right.
and their role as national leaders, because there is a real crisis in Egypt and something that could spin further out of control if not stemmed pretty soon.
Is there among the political class, if we could characterize such a thing, are there emerging leaders that are recognized beyond their immediate institutional bounds, that are recognized as potential leaders of a future Egypt?
Sure, I mean, and this is one of the problems, right, is that we're seeing new political structures, new political organizations. It's hard.
It's happening.
I mean, it's happening, but that's a process that takes time. There are some personalities that are now on the political scene. Someone like Amr Moussa, who's well known to people in the West, who used to be Egypt's foreign minister for many years, frequent guest on shows like Charlie Rose.
Yep.
So, I mean, people have a sense of him, and he still is, at this point, the front runner for Egypt's presidential elections. You have people like Mohamed Elbaradei, who is a longtime resident of New York, where he got his PhD.
Good friend of mine. We were
yes.
at the Center for International Studies at NYU together.
Right. And a good man, and someone who is perhaps not a populist politician, but has carved out a role for himself because of his unswerving positions, and people in the protest movement have maybe grudgingly come to recognize his utility because he is a man of integrity and so he's carved out a role for
And
himself.
he's got an international presence, Nobel
Absolutely.
Prize winner, head of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Is there a figure that, in a sense, transcends the divisions that you're talking about,
Not
or does
at
it
this
just
point.
have to play out?
It's going to have to play out.
Okay.
I mean, I think once you have a president in place, and we're now looking at perhaps June, June 2012 is the date for presidential elections, or the hoped-for date, and that's going to be a very key moment because that's supposed to be the moment when the military transitions and transfers full authority to a civilian government.
Likely? You're sanguine?
I'm sanguine because the military is going to have a big role regardless.
Right, and it's been structured that way.
But it's different to have a big role behind the scenes as opposed to a big role being written into the Constitution.
Right.
And so those are two different things. And so we'll see a powerful military, but it will be a question whether it is a powerful military running the country or a powerful military with its own sphere of influence and a role in important national security decisions.
Okay, let's move to the second real major event of the last couple of weeks, and that is the quote unquote the end of the Iraq War. And the headline in the Washington Post on December 15th was, "The Iraq War draws to a quiet close." Not only was it quiet, it was buried on page 20 of the Times or whatever. Americans don't want to know, in a sense, don't want to know this. So the war that began, on CNN, the shock and awe war, it draws to a quiet close. And Panetta talked about giving the Iraqis a chance, and then Obama, walking that line between blame and sort of hopefulness that we've given them a chance. Now, I've got my own position on the war, but it seems, $1 trillion plus later, 4,500 dead plus tens of thousands of casualties. Was it worth it?
Absolutely not. I mean, there's no question at this point of whether it was worth it. I mean, on a moral, on a financial, on a human level, clearly, and on a strategic level. I mean, we shouldn't forget
Right.
this.
No.
fourth
I
one.
want to talk about the strategic.
It was an
level.
utter and complete disaster. And I think the lack of accountability among people, among my peers, among the foreign policy and the think tank crowd, a lack of accountability for those who pushed this war and who refuse to see the potential downsides, I think is really quite appalling. That being said, that's past.
Right.
Of course we want to hope for the best for Iraq.
Right.
And
Be realistic.
no, I mean, it is a divided place. It is a divided country. It's divided on sectarian grounds, and in recent days we've seen a sharpening of those divisions.
Yep.
It's a society that's scarred by, the reign, a horribly repressive reign of Saddam Hussein, the Iran-Iraq War, the first Gulf War, 10 years of devastating sanctions, the last war that began in 2003. It's a traumatized society, and so it's going to be a slow process. We haven't seen any real moves yet on national reconciliation.
None.
So,
In fact, what you've got is you've got the Maliki regime using repressive tactics against their enemies.
we do see that. I mean, I would go back. 2009 was a very hopeful moment after parliamentary elections
Right.
there, and you started to see cross-sectarian politics, and there was a sort of a very fleeting moment when it looked like the past. You can't do away with the past, but that there was going to be something new, a different kind of politics in Iraq, and the old logic of sectarianism and division reasserted itself very quickly, and we haven't yet gotten back to that moment.
And we have what you characterized earlier, if not a totally corrupt, but a sizably corrupt regime.
Absolutely. I mean, it is a different type of regime. There are elections. I wouldn't say that we have a democratic political culture in Iraq, far from it. But these people have been elected by sizable numbers of voters. There's huge issues of corruption within the government, but we're going to see elections going forward. I mean, I think it is a different type of regime, say, than what we saw in Egypt under Mubarak.
Is it a different type of regime, or is it a regime that is legitimized by elections, and are elections democracy? I mean,
Well, it's part of democracy.
Okay.
I mean, I would hesitate to equate elections to democracy.
Sure.
There's a lot more than that. There are very anti-majoritarian aspects of democracy, ensuring rights and freedoms for
Excuse
others.
me. You have Federalist
obviously.
10 to
There you
James
go.
Madison. It's right in your corner.
So, will of the people is part of it, but it can't be all of it. And so, I think establishing a democratic political culture is a thing of decades as opposed to, months and years.
On December 19th, Wall Street Journal, the headline reads, "Government teeters among feuding." Is the government teetering?
Perhaps. I mean,
okay.
the thing we've seen with Iraq is an ability to muddle through crisis. And because the scars and the wounds, I think particularly of the sectarian civil war of 2006, 2007, are so recent, I do think there is a reluctance to go back to to fighting. I think it's hard to imagine a broad-based insurgency, a real civil war happening again, as opposed to terrorism, which we see now, and is something that I think Iraq will struggle with for 5-10 years to come.
U.S. foreign policy in the region, we're withdrawing from Iraq. Where do our strategic interests lie, and what is the policy that attains these strategic objectives?
Well, I mean, clearly we've been reactive. We are responding to emerging events, and that's not surprising.
Right.
I've been quite critical of various aspects of administration policy over the past, almost year. But I think one thing to always bear in mind, it's very difficult, and it's very difficult to move what is a unwieldy interagency process when you have emergent situations. So, I think it's important to caveat, to say this is hard, this isn't easy. You can't change government policies that have been held for 30 years in some cases overnight at the drop of a hat. That being said, we have been a little bit slow to react. We haven't formulated a coherent picture about where we're headed. And maybe that's natural because there isn't a coherent picture to place on this region.
Right.
I mean, it is somewhat ad hoc. It is somewhat piecemeal. You have to deal with Saudi Arabia differently than you're going to deal with Tunisia and Egypt, say. But it's clear that we are now in a position reacting to what is emerging on the ground. And you know, if there's anything that we see now, it's that we're taking our cues from notions of popular legitimacy. And it's an important signal to send to allies that if you lose the trust of your people, we're not going to be there to save you, and nor should we be. You know, that's an important message to send. I know that when Mubarak fell, many of our allies in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and others, were very upset by how we treated Mubarak. Sure. They said, you know, your ally of so long, you cut him loose overnight. How can we trust you? And I think when I was in the Gulf speaking with leaders there, I think one thing that I tried to get across is that this isn't our responsibility. Right. Your relationship with your people is your own. Our support for you cannot cover over such things. If you lose that legitimacy with your own people, that's not something that the United States can compensate for, and it's not something we're going to try to do. And I hope that's a position that's now become sort of bedrock policy in the administration.
You come back in 6 months. What might we say?
You know, it's been 10 months of chaos and instability. It's hard to say. I mean, I think Tunisia obviously is the smoothest example. The array of political forces create for a much more checks and balances even when internally, and so the scale of the place lends itself to a much smoother transition. I think Egypt is going to take quite a long time.
And Iraq?
I think Iraq is probably going to avoid worst case scenarios. I think we're probably muddling through much like we are now. But you know, that if you're coming up against the edge like that, it always begs the question of whether how long this can be sustained, and it's not a favorable place for the country to be. We've
got to say goodbye, but we haven't visited Iran. We have not visited Syria. We haven't looked at Turkey. So you have to come back.
I'd be happy
and
to.
we have to continue this tour of the Middle East. My thanks to Michael Wahid Hanna for joining us today. Learn more about the Century Foundation. Check out their website at tcf.org. Next week, Robert Hammond and Joshua David return to talk about the High Line. And we are joined by Dan Barish, co-founder of the Delancey Underground, or the Low Line, here on CUNY TV. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.